later this afternoon. I got to them. Oh boy, and I can't say who they are, and I can't really say.
That's fine.
And I can't really say what they told me, but it's ironclad. It's 1,000% true. Okay, I know exactly what happened to the kids. The kids are alive.
In a quiet corner of Canada, life once moved with the slow, familiar rhythm that defines small towns. Streets were lined with modest homes where front doors were left unlocked, and neighbors knew each other by name. Children's laughter drifted through open windows in the evenings, the sound of innocence mixing with the rustle of leaves in the wind. Trust wasn't just a value here, it was the invisible thread holding everything together. People believed their community was safe, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But then, slowly, something began to change. The shift didn't come with a sudden explosion or headline-worthy event. It arrived in silence, carried on the wind, hidden in a haze that most tried to ignore at first. It began with smoke. At first, Daniel Martell's backyard fires seemed ordinary enough, nothing more than what rural living had always included. In places like this, burning brush, twigs, or the leftover debris from clearing land wasn't unusual. Many locals had their own fire pits or burn piles. It was tradition, practicality, a way to manage waste without the hassle of long drives to the landfill. For weeks, perhaps months, people passed by Martell's property without suspicion. To the casual eye, it was just another man tending another fire. But soon, the details began to shift. The flames were no longer the soft orange and yellow of ordinary wood fires. They deepened, burned hotter, sharper. The smoke, too, changed, from thin gray wisps into thick plumes of black, curling skyward in menacing columns that could be seen from miles away. And the smell, it was impossible to ignore. Acrid, chemical, heavy enough to sting the back of the throat and settle in the lungs. It clung to clothing, seeped through windows, and carried an unnatural weight that had nothing to do with ordinary brush or timber. Neighbors began to whisper. Some thought maybe he was burning tires. Others speculated about construction waste. A few who lived closest swore they recognized the distinct bite of burning plastics, that sharp, unmistakable odor that makes even the most casual passerby wince. For those who inhaled it night after night, the concern was no longer casual. They felt it in their bodies, irritated eyes, scratchy throats, persistent coughs. The fires weren't harmless. They were toxic. Complaints trickled out quietly at first. A phone call here, a remark at a community meeting there. Have you noticed that smell? Have you seen the color of that smoke? But as time passed, the questions grew louder, more insistent. Parents worried about their children breathing it in while playing outside. Farmers wondered what it was doing to their soil, their crops, their animals. The very air felt corrupted, poisoned, a silent invader that didn't stop at property lines. The community, once bound together by trust, began to fracture under the weight of those fires. Neighbors who had lived in peace for years now traded uneasy glances, whispering about Martell but hesitant to confront him directly. There was something intimidating in his silence, in his stubborn continuation of the fires despite the growing unease. Some said he was defiant, others that he simply didn't care. But beneath it all lay an unspoken question. Why was nothing being done? For many, the sight of those black plumes rising above the treeline marked the end of innocence. The town no longer felt untouched. What once was safe now seemed fragile. The rhythm of small-town life, so steady for decades, faltered with each acrid wave of smoke. Parents pulled their children indoors, windows stayed closed, and conversations about Martell's fires dominated dinner tables. The community could no longer pretend this was ordinary. What was happening was dangerous. What was happening was illegal. And yet, it continued. From kitchen windows, families stared helplessly as the plumes drifted across their homes. What began as faint trails soon became thick, suffocating waves that rolled over rooftops and settled in the streets like an invisible invader. Curtains absorbed the stench, so that even freshly washed fabrics carried the odor of chemicals. Laundry hung on backyard lines came back inside smelling not of sunshine, but of acrid smoke. Children who once ran barefoot through the grass now coughed themselves to sleep at night. Mothers pressed cool cloths to fevered foreheads, fathers closed every window tight, but still the fumes slipped in. The town was suffocating, one burn pile at a time. Complaints weren't just whispered anymore. They were written down, phoned in, and sent up the chain. Parents called local authorities, desperate for someone to intervene. Neighbors filed formal grievances, listing the dates, times, and severity of the smoke. Letters circulated. The warnings were explicit. Something dangerous is happening here. Yet with every call logged, every report stamped, the outcome remained the same. No visits, no enforcement, no consequences. The smoke kept rising, blacker and thicker, a signal fire of neglect that hung over the community. For Lilly and Jack, the cost was measured not in frustration but in their very breath. Their small bodies were closest to the source, their fragile lungs taking in more than anyone else. To them, the fires weren't just an inconvenience or a foul smell, they were poison. Lily's cough, once mild, grew persistent, rattling through her chest and refusing to leave. Nights became restless for her, her tiny frame shaking as she struggled to clear her lungs. Jack, once vibrant and full of the boundless energy that defines young children, began to slow down. He grew fatigued easily, dragging his feet at school, his spark dimming with each passing week. Teachers noticed his head drooping on desks, his laughter replaced by exhaustion. Their parents, alarmed and desperate, sought medical answers. Again and again, they rushed Lilly and Jack to clinics and doctors' offices. Stethoscopes pressed to chests, thermometers tucked under tongues, prescriptions scribbled onto pads. The pattern repeated itself: inhalers, cough syrups, allergy pills. The answers were always the same: it's the air quality. Doctors acknowledged the irritation, the pollutants, the possibility of toxins. But beyond that, no solution was offered. No one traced the symptoms back to the flames that were still burning just yards away. And so the cycle continued. Martell lit his fires. The smoke billowed. Lilly coughed. Jack grew weaker. Their parents searched for remedies, but the system they trusted turned its back on the cause. With each day that passed, the children's bodies carried more of the toxins, their health eroded piece by piece. What should have been carefree days of running through grass and chasing the setting sun turned into a battle for clean breaths of air. Neighbors knew it. Doctors suspected it. The parents lived it. But still, nothing stopped the source. Neighbors noticed something that chilled them more than the smoke itself. Daniel Martell wasn't oblivious to the danger he was creating. He was protecting himself from it. Each time he stood over his backyard infernos, he wore a thick protective mask strapped tightly across his face. To anyone watching, the message was unmistakable. He knew. He knew the fumes were toxic, he knew the chemicals were dangerous, and yet he carried on, choosing to shield only himself while leaving everyone else, including Lilly and Jack, defenseless. The image burned into the community's memory. A grown man armored against poison while children, barely tall enough to see over the fence line, coughed in the open air with lungs that had no defense. For parents living nearby, this detail was unbearable. It stripped away any possibility that Martell was simply careless or ignorant. His mask was proof of knowledge, proof of intent. If he understood the danger enough to cover his own mouth and nose, then he also understood the risk it posed to others. And still, he let the smoke drift into yards, schools, living rooms. Still, he let Lilly and Jack breathe it in day after day. It wasn't just selfish, it was calculated neglect. As the plumes grew darker and the stench thicker, the community's frustration hardened into outrage. This wasn't just a neighborly dispute about noise or property lines. This was about survival. Formal complaints began to pour in, one after another. The descriptions were hauntingly consistent: thick black smoke rolling across rooftops, an acrid stench that stung the throat and eyes, children waking with headaches, parents doubled over with nausea, and entire families reporting burning lungs after even a few minutes outdoors. People didn't just rely on words. They documented. Some neighbors pulled out their phones and filmed the plumes rising like storm clouds above their homes, the black smoke curling against a sky that should have been blue. They zoomed in on Martell himself, mask strapped to his face, gloves on his hands, feeding wire and plastic into the flames. Others kept records. Doctors' notes piled up, pages describing respiratory irritation, unexplained coughs, allergic reactions, and fatigue. Parents collected prescriptions as evidence, each bottle a silent witness to what their children were enduring. It wasn't only about their own health. Every parent knew that Lilly and Jack, living just steps from the fires, bore the worst of it. Neighbors whispered in hushed tones, horrified at the thought of the children's tiny lungs working overtime against poisons that adults couldn't even stand for long. Some admitted they stayed up at night, unable to sleep, replaying the sight of Martell's mask in their minds. The image felt like a cruel metaphor, an adult saving himself while sacrificing the innocent. And yet, despite the mounting evidence, every complaint seemed to hit the same immovable wall. Phone calls to environmental inspectors went unanswered or ended with vague reassurances. Reports filed with local authorities were acknowledged but never acted upon. Families begged for intervention, only to be met with silence or red tape. Time and again, the smoke would rise, the fires would burn, and nothing changed. It was a silence that grew heavier with each passing day. For those who spoke up, the lack of response felt like betrayal. What good were rules about air quality or bans on burning toxic materials if no one enforced them? What good was a system that recorded complaints but left families choking in their homes? Parents began to wonder whether their voices mattered at all. Some suspected incompetence. Others whispered darker theories, that Martell was connected, shielded, protected by someone higher up. Because how else could a man openly poison his neighbors, wear a mask to prove he knew it, and still face no consequences? The silence wasn't neutral, it was damning. Every day that officials ignored the complaints, the fires grew bolder, the damage spread wider, and the danger to Lilly and Jack deepened. For the families living in that quiet community, the mask became more than just a piece of equipment. It was a symbol of everything that was wrong: Martell's indifference, the system's failure, and the chilling knowledge that while some people were protected, others, the most vulnerable, were left to suffer. By then, it wasn't just smoke staining the skies. It was distrust staining the town itself. Lilly and Jack's health didn't decline suddenly. It was a slow unraveling, the kind that crept in day by day until the difference was undeniable. Their school absences began to stack up like grim markers of the toll their bodies could no longer withstand. What might have seemed at first like the occasional sick day turned into weeks riddled with missed classes. Their teachers, accustomed to the sound of their laughter and the sight of their eager faces, started to notice something different. When Lilly and Jack did make it to school, they weren't the same children. Lilly, once lively and full of curiosity, now sat slumped at her desk, her face pale, her energy drained. Her cough echoed in the classroom, a dry, relentless sound that made other children glance at her with worry. Jack, normally a burst of movement and energy, seemed weighed down, his small shoulders sagging, his eyes dulled with fatigue. His once bright spirit faded into silence, and his teachers, watching him drift through the days, knew something wasn't right. Friends noticed too. Children who once played with Lilly and Jack after school stopped hearing from them. Invitations went unanswered, games went unplayed. One by one, those bonds slipped away, not because the children no longer cared, but because sickness kept Lilly and Jack behind closed doors. A silence settled over their absence. A silence first felt in classrooms, then whispered about in neighborhoods. Parents spoke in hushed voices, wondering why nothing was being done. Kids asked where their friends had gone. It wasn't only illness, it was erasure. Piece by piece, the children were disappearing from their own world long before they vanished altogether. Finally, after months of smoke, complaints, and whispers, the silence was broken, not by neighbors, not by teachers, but by the arrival of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. When their vehicles pulled up to Martell's property, it felt like the weight of the community's desperation had finally forced action. For the first time, there was an official presence, a sense that perhaps someone would uncover the truth. Investigators stepped onto the land with deliberate precision. They carried equipment, air monitors, soil collectors, evidence bags, and began to comb through every inch of Martell's backyard. What they found was not the careless disorder of a man simply burning trash. It was something far more chilling, far more deliberate. The soil beneath the charred patches told its own story. Samples pulled from the blackened earth tested positive for industrial solvents, melted plastics, and scorched rubber. The ground was saturated with toxins, its natural composition warped by chemicals no rural property should ever contain. Air quality monitors spiked almost immediately, registering levels of pollutants that would have been dangerous even for short exposure, levels that Lilly and Jack had endured day after day. And then there was the ash. Investigators collected it carefully, sifting through the gray remains of countless fires. Within it, they found fragments, minute particles that didn't belong, that suggested not just waste burning but systematic destruction. These weren't the byproducts of brush fires or yard cleanups. They were the remains of something intentional, something designed to conceal or destroy. The scene was no longer one of rural living. It was a crime scene, hiding in plain sight. The black plumes that neighbors had described for months weren't just pollution, they were smoke signals of a darker truth. Evidence wasn't just floating in the air or sinking into the soil. It was pointing to the reality that what happened on Martell's property wasn't just reckless, it was criminal. For the first time, the community's worst fears were confirmed. This wasn't just about environmental damage. It wasn't just about toxic smoke. The evidence collected told investigators that something far more sinister had been unfolding behind that cottage. And Lilly and Jack, the children everyone had been worried about, were at the heart of it. Soil samples, once seen as nothing more than dirt beneath a yard, became damning evidence under the scrutiny of investigators. What those samples revealed was undeniable. The ground was soaked with toxins linked to the burning of plastics, wires, and insulation. These weren't the harmless byproducts of fallen branches or garden waste. They were the chemical signatures of deliberate, repeated incineration of man-made materials. Polyvinyl chloride from stripped cables. Heavy metals leached from scorched circuits. Residues of industrial adhesives baked into the earth. The soil itself had become a toxic archive, recording every fire Martell had set. The danger didn't end at the ground. Air quality tests confirmed what neighbors had been saying for months. The very breath of the community had been contaminated. Invisible particles, sharp enough to scar lung tissue, hovered in the air long after the flames were gone. Carcinogens clung to the wind, drifting into homes, into schools, into the fragile lungs of children who had no choice but to breathe them in. This wasn't just a nuisance, it was a silent assault, a danger that hung over the entire community whether people acknowledged it or not. But the most horrifying discoveries weren't in the data sheets or chemical breakdowns. They were in the ashes. Investigators knelt in the blackened pits, carefully sifting through the brittle remains of what had once been consumed by fire. At first, it looked like nothing more than melted lumps and indistinguishable debris. But slowly, shapes began to emerge. A warped piece of plastic, melted at the edges, revealed itself as part of a toy, a fragment of something that once carried joy, now twisted and blackened. Beside it lay scorched fibers of fabric, threads that under lab analysis matched the patterns and dyes consistent with children's clothing. These weren't random scraps. They weren't garbage tossed aside after spring cleaning. They were objects too specific, too intimate to dismiss. A doll's arm, brittle from the flames. A half-melted toy car, its wheels fused to its base. Shreds of cloth that still bore the faint outlines of stitching from garments small enough to fit a child. Each item carried a weight far heavier than its physical form. They were relics of Lilly and Jack's world. Things that should have been in their bedrooms, in their toy bins, in their hands. The air in the investigation tents grew heavier as these items were catalogued. Officers who had trained their minds to remain detached struggled to process what they were seeing. These weren't just clues. They were memories destroyed. Parents held their children's toys at night, not burned fragments in an evidence bag. Teachers helped their students hang coats, not examine their fibers under microscopes. And yet, here they were, personal belongings, the essence of childhood, reduced to char and ash. Forensic analysts noted the chilling detail. These objects hadn't simply caught fire by accident. They had been thrown into the flames. The degree of charring, the placement among other burned waste, the chemical residues, they all pointed to deliberate destruction. Someone had wanted these items gone. Someone had fed them to the fire, knowing what they were, knowing who they belonged to. The implications were devastating. What investigators held in their gloved hands wasn't just pollution, it was potential evidence of children erased. Lilly's favorite toy, Jack's clothing. The ordinary, everyday markers of their presence now served as silent witnesses to what might have happened. Each burned fragment was both proof and accusation, screaming the same question without words. Why? For the community, news of these discoveries trickled out like poison, leaving people reeling. Neighbors who had once watched Lilly and Jack play in their yard now pictured their toys destroyed in flames. Parents who had complained about the smoke now imagined what else those plumes had carried. And everyone, no matter how far from Martell's property, felt the same sickening realization that the fires weren't just polluting the air. They were consuming lives, memories, and innocence. The investigation that began as a search for environmental violations had morphed into something darker. It wasn't about illegal burning anymore. It was about children. It was about what had been hidden in plain sight, masked by smoke until it was too late. And in those charred toy fragments and scorched fibers, investigators found the most haunting evidence yet that Lilly and Jack's disappearance was not simply a case of two children gone missing, it was a tragedy written in ash. By now, Lilly and Jack had slipped completely out of public life, their presence erased from the routines of the community that once knew them so well. The absence was felt everywhere, like a ghost that lingered in the spaces they used to fill. The schoolyard, once alive with their laughter and games, seemed quieter, the children who had played with them moving on in body but glancing back in spirit, wondering why their friends had stopped showing up. Desks sat empty for days, then weeks, until teachers stopped calling their names during roll. Report cards bore absences instead of grades, and hallways where their footsteps once echoed became corridors of silence. At home, the neighborhood felt hollow without their energy spilling into the streets. No more bikes in the driveway. No more chalk drawings on the pavement. No squeals of laughter drifting over fences as they chased each other in the fading light of summer evenings. Instead, there was nothing. Just silence. Silence where once there had been life, and an ache in the hearts of those who noticed the change but could do nothing to reverse it. For some, that silence was almost unbearable. Neighbors confessed later that they would stand by their kitchen windows at dusk, straining to hear the children's voices over the hum of insects and the rustle of leaves. But nothing came. Only the faint, acrid smell of smoke drifting on the wind. The absence of Lilly and Jack was more than just physical. It was a haunting void, a reminder that something terrible had taken hold right under everyone's noses. The question began to rise, unspoken at first but impossible to silence. Had the children been slowly poisoned by Martell's fires? Was every cough, every dizzy spell, every absence from school a symptom of toxic smoke eroding their bodies from the inside out? The idea chilled parents throughout the community, who looked at their own children and wondered how close they might have come to the same fate. Every headache, every fever in their households suddenly felt sinister, like a warning sign they had missed. But the fires carried another, even darker suspicion. What if they weren't just poisoning the children? What if they were concealing something worse? The fragments uncovered in the ash seemed to whisper of horrors that no one wanted to name out loud. Toys, clothing, scraps that should have belonged in bedrooms or closets, not burned pits. What if the fires had served a second purpose, not just to fill the air with toxins, but to destroy evidence no one was ever meant to see? For investigators, this was the unspoken theory that loomed over every new piece of evidence. It was one thing to connect the children's health decline to environmental poisoning. It was another to consider that the very fires which had sickened them might have also been used to erase the truth of what ultimately happened to them. The charred toys, the scorched fabric, each fragment was a suggestion, a whisper of an answer too terrible to fully articulate. And that was the weight the community carried, the sense that the silence surrounding Lilly and Jack wasn't natural, wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. It was the silence of evidence consumed in flames, of voices smothered by smoke, of lives erased by a man who had always known enough to wear a mask while the children around him had none. The fragments in the ash told a story no one wanted to believe, but everyone feared was true. They pointed not just to neglect, but to something intentional, an act of erasure carried out in plain sight, under the cover of smoke that drifted over houses, schools, and fields, marking the sky with the darkest kind of truth. The question remained suspended in the air like the smoke itself, choking everyone who dared to ask it. Had Lilly and Jack been poisoned slowly over time, or had they been consumed in a single, deliberate act meant to leave nothing behind? The silence where their laughter once rang out gave the most haunting answer of all. The town erupted like a long-dormant fault line finally splitting open. For years, the smoke had been a background nuisance, annoying, sometimes sickening, but never fully confronted. Now, in the light of what investigators had uncovered, no one could ignore it. Parents who once waved it away as just a smell now looked at their own children with dread. Every lingering cough, every unexplained fever, every dark circle under young eyes became a potential sign of poison. The smoke had seeped into more than lungs. It had seeped into trust, into safety, into the very air of the community. Overnight, quiet neighborhoods turned into battlegrounds of outrage. Living rooms became war rooms as families gathered to compare symptoms, stories, and fears. One mother kept a log of every day her son missed school with a hacking cough. Another father produced jars of blackened dust he had scraped from his window ledges. People who had never spoken much beyond neighborly greetings now clutched each other's arms in solidarity, voices trembling with the same refrain. What was happening to our children? Community groups formed almost instantly. Church basements overflowed with parents, grandparents, teachers, and activists, their voices a storm of grief and fury. Meetings stretched long into the night, filled with raw emotion, shouts, tears, and a hunger for answers that no one seemed willing or able to give. Hand-painted signs began appearing in yards and storefronts. Stop the fires. Protect our kids. Justice for Lilly and Jack. Grief was the undercurrent, but anger was the fuel. Some pointed their rage directly at Daniel Martell, demanding his arrest, his removal, his exile. Others turned their fire on the authorities, the town council, the health board, even the RCMP, for failing to act sooner, for letting the smoke linger long enough to leave its mark on 2 children who had now vanished. "Where were you when the kids were coughing?" one mother shouted at a heated town meeting. "Where were you when we begged for inspections? When we called about the smoke choking our homes? Where were you then?" Her voice cracked, but the applause that erupted after carried her words like a battle cry. Even those who had once defended Martell, the ones who said he was just burning garbage, or that the smell wasn't that bad, now fell silent. Some avoided eye contact at the grocery store. Others whispered behind closed doors, ashamed they hadn't spoken up sooner. The silence around Martell that had once protected him was gone, replaced by a chorus of accusation that grew louder with every passing day. And through it all, the names of Lilly and Jack were on everyone's lips. The children had become symbols of the community's collective failure, and its collective fight for justice. They weren't just missing. They were martyrs to a cause no one had chosen but everyone was now bound to. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was desperation. Parents wanted answers, but they also wanted vengeance. What had once been a quiet town now pulsed with tension, grief, and the kind of unity born only from shared tragedy. And as the voices grew louder, one question echoed over every meeting, every vigil, every shouted demand at the gates of Martell's property. What really happened to Lilly and Jack? Their faces were everywhere. Lilly and Jack's smiles, once snapshots of innocence tucked inside family photo albums, were now blown up into posters that seemed to cry out from every corner of the town. The walls of their school, where classmates once shared crayons and secrets with them, were plastered with flyers bearing the words, "Missing," in bold red ink. The hallways had grown quieter, the laughter subdued, as every child who passed those posters felt the weight of absence. Teachers hung them not just as reminders, but as silent apologies that they hadn't recognized the signs sooner. In church basements where vigils were held, the same posters hung beside flickering candles. Parishioners bowed their heads in prayer, but the photographs kept their eyes open, reminders that prayers were not enough, that something had been stolen from the community long before Lilly and Jack vanished into silence. The basement walls, usually decorated with banners for bake sales and food drives, now bore the faces of 2 children the town had failed to protect. And outside, on protest signs carried by mothers, fathers, and teenagers with tears in their eyes, the images took on an even sharper edge. No longer just photographs of missing children, they had become symbols of outrage. The words beneath their faces weren't always pleas for help. Sometimes they were accusations, ignored until it was too late. They warned you. Who failed Lilly and Jack? The images weren't passive anymore. They demanded to be seen, to be reckoned with. The town square, once a place of farmers' markets and community festivals, was now a gallery of grief. Flyers flapped against lampposts in the late summer breeze, their edges curling but their message unyielding. Children who used to play tag in those streets now clung tightly to their parents' hands, wide-eyed as they watched adults march with signs. Some of the kids even drew their own posters, scrawling Lilly and Jack's names in crayon as if writing them could bring them back. It wasn't just a campaign for missing children. It was an indictment of silence. Every taped flyer, every candlelit poster, every sign waved in the air shouted the same truth. This wasn't just a disappearance. This was the result of warnings ignored, smoke overlooked, and a community too patient until patience turned into tragedy. And the deeper tragedy was clear. Those innocent faces had been transformed into something they never should have been: evidence. Evidence of a system's neglect. Evidence of a man's unchecked recklessness. Evidence of a town's loss. Now, wherever people walked, into schools, churches, grocery stores, even their own homes, they couldn't escape the gaze of Lilly and Jack. It was as though the children were still present, their smiles pressing against the conscience of every adult who saw them. Each face whispered not just "find us," but "remember what you failed to stop." The posters had become mirrors, forcing the community to look at itself, and the reflection was unbearable. The protests started small, just a handful of mothers gathering outside the local government office, clutching signs they had made the night before with markers and cardboard. But within days, it had grown into something no one could ignore. Parents pushed strollers through the crowd, their children bundled inside with wide, uncertain eyes. Retirees who had lived in the town for decades, people who once believed in the safety of their quiet community, marched shoulder to shoulder with teenagers carrying hand-painted signs streaked with urgency. "Where are Lilly and Jack?" and "Who failed our children?" The chants echoed through the streets, bouncing off storefront windows and reverberating in the alleys. This wasn't just outrage directed at Daniel Martell. It was fury at the silence, at the inaction, at the systems that had turned away when the smoke first rose and the complaints first landed on official desks. Every voice in the protest carried the same message. Enough had been ignored. No more excuses. Local news cameras rolled, capturing the sea of faces. Mothers with tears running down their cheeks spoke into microphones, recounting the nights their own children coughed from the acrid smoke. Fathers held up signs scrawled with angry words: "Justice for Lilly and Jack. Stop protecting monsters. Silence equals complicity." These weren't distant strangers demanding justice. These were neighbors, teachers, workers, ordinary people who had seen the warning signs and now carried the guilt of doing too little, too late. The protests spread beyond the town square. Cars honked in solidarity as marchers moved through the streets. Local businesses taped posters in their windows, joining the movement without saying a word. Churches rang their bells in support as the crowd passed. Even children walked among them, their small voices chanting the names of Lilly and Jack, their innocence transforming the cries into something haunting, unforgettable. And as the days went on, the marches didn't fade, they grew. What began as a local outcry became a movement spilling into regional headlines, then national broadcasts. People across Canada began asking the same questions. How had complaints gone unanswered? How had officials allowed a man to burn toxic waste in plain sight? How had 2 children slipped through every crack until they vanished entirely? The rage was no longer contained. It was no longer about a single suspect, a single act. It had widened into something larger, a reckoning with negligence, with complacency, with the uncomfortable truth that children like Lilly and Jack are too often sacrificed to bureaucracy and delay. Every step of the protest carried that weight. Every chant demanded not just answers, but accountability. The town wasn't simply asking what happened to Lilly and Jack anymore. They were demanding to know, who among us failed them? And who will answer for it? The questions spread faster than the smoke ever had, and they clung to every conversation in town. Was Martell simply reckless, a man too lazy to dispose of his waste properly, too careless to consider the consequences? Or was there something calculated behind those flames, something darker than copper wire and melted plastic? The fires, once dismissed as a nuisance, now carried the weight of terrifying possibility. Neighbors replayed what they had seen in their minds. Martell standing over the flames, his protective mask in place, the heat rising against the night sky. If he knew the smoke was dangerous enough to shield himself, why not protect the children who lived in the very home he claimed to care for? Why did he go on night after night, feeding the fires with more than just brush or trash? The rumors multiplied. Some whispered that the burn pits were nothing more than a cheap way to strip copper, a desperate man's shortcut to make money. But others weren't convinced. The black smoke, the strange smells, the items that surfaced in the ash, half-melted toys, charred fragments that looked too familiar. Could this have been a cover? A way to destroy something unspeakable? Parents in the community felt a sickness settle in their stomachs. They tucked their own children in at night and wondered what Lilly and Jack had endured, what they had breathed, what they had seen. The idea that those flames had been used to erase evidence gnawed at everyone, a thought too horrifying to name but impossible to silence. The questions weighed heavy, choking conversations in grocery stores, at gas stations, in church pews. Even the silence carried suspicion. No one could look at the rising smoke without wondering, what had Martell really been burning? What secret was hidden in those flames? And yet, no answer came. The RCMP spoke in careful phrases, but the community read between the lines. There was more than recklessness here. There was intent. Whether the fires began as waste disposal or something darker, by the time Lilly and Jack disappeared, they had become symbols of dread, smoke signals for a truth no one wanted to confront. The community inhaled that dread with every memory of the black sky. The fires were no longer just flames in a backyard. They were questions, accusations, and perhaps evidence. The case of Daniel Martell's fires was no longer about one man. At first, the community wanted to believe this was the story of a reckless stepfather who made terrible choices in a backyard, a man who ignored the laws of his province and the health of his neighbors. But as investigators pulled soil samples, as parents marched with protest signs, as journalists filed stories that rippled beyond Nova Scotia, it became clear that this wasn't only about Martell. It was about something far more unsettling. Institutions that failed to act, warnings ignored again and again, silence that hung heavier than the smoke itself. This silence wasn't the silence of ignorance. It was the silence of awareness left unanswered. Complaints had been filed, neighbors reported the toxic fumes, parents described headaches, nausea, and their children's chronic coughs. Doctors noted patterns in Lilly and Jack's medical visits, teachers observed their fatigue and fading concentration. Every thread led back to that property, that man, that fire pit. Yet the authorities, the very bodies entrusted to protect the vulnerable, allowed the warnings to collect dust. When investigators finally entered Martell's yard with their testing kits, the earth itself seemed to testify. Soil samples came back poisoned with residues tied to plastics, PVC insulation, solvents, chemicals known not just for their toxicity but for their illegality when burned. The grass had died in wide circles around the pits, the ground cracked from repeated heat. What should have been an ordinary backyard was transformed into a scarred wasteland. In the ash, they found more than the chemical traces. They found fragments. Tiny, heartbreaking artifacts of Lilly and Jack's short lives. A doll's melted face, warped and blistered by fire. The plastic handle of what once may have been a toy truck, its colors blackened beyond recognition. Scraps of fabric, fibers that bore the unmistakable weave of children's clothing. These were not anonymous objects. They belonged to someone. They belonged to Lilly and Jack's world. The findings were gut-wrenching, but still incomplete. Pollution could be measured, toys could be identified, medical files could trace the slow poisoning of two young bodies, but none of it answered the one question that rang louder than any protest chant, louder than any investigative press conference. Where are Lilly and Jack? That absence, that gap in the narrative, became unbearable. The case turned from an environmental crime into something darker, a mystery wrapped in dread. If the fires had been used to dispose of copper wires, why did children's belongings end up in the flames? If the coughs, fatigue, and constant medical visits hinted at poisoning, what was the breaking point? Did Lilly and Jack succumb to years of exposure? Or had something worse happened, something the fires were meant to erase? Every theory carried its own horrors. Some believed Martell's recklessness had gone too far, that the children had been exposed to lethal levels of toxins over time and their fragile bodies finally gave out. Others whispered about arguments, violence, a rage boiling over in the household. To them, the fires were not just waste disposal, they were cover, a deliberate attempt to burn away evidence of a crime too unspeakable to confront directly. The RCMP pressed forward, but even their presence raised as many questions as it answered. Why had they not intervened sooner? How many reports had been shelved, delayed, or dismissed before the children disappeared? Why were neighbors told that their complaints were not actionable when smoke thick enough to blacken skies was visible for miles? And most damning of all, would anything have been done if Lilly and Jack hadn't vanished? The community, already grieving, began to rage. They filled the streets with protests. Parents wheeled strollers alongside retirees holding signs demanding justice. Teenagers painted Lilly and Jack's faces on cardboard and lifted them above their heads as chants echoed through town. Where are Lilly and Jack? Who failed our children? The signs weren't aimed only at Martell, they were aimed at city halls, health departments, and police detachments that had all, in their own way, turned a blind eye. The anger was justified. Because the tragedy was not one of secrecy. This was not a crime hidden in shadows, but one that billowed smoke into the sky for all to see. The fires weren't invisible. They were visible from kitchen windows, smelled in the air for blocks, and tasted in every cough. If children's lungs were poisoned, it wasn't in silence, it was in plain sight. Every institution bore some share of blame. Environmental agencies had the tools to stop the burns but never followed through with enforcement. Healthcare providers flagged concerns but had no mechanism to escalate them into protection. Schools noticed the changes in Lilly and Jack but lacked the authority to intervene beyond recording absences. The RCMP had received calls, reports, perhaps even evidence, but their response was slow, bureaucratic, and detached. The deeper people looked, the more it seemed the fires had burned not only plastic and rubber but accountability itself. Each agency, each authority, had passed the responsibility to another until responsibility vanished in the smoke. And still, the haunting absence of Lilly and Jack lingered. Vigils burned with candles, and with every flicker came more questions. The charred toys in the ash pit, were they destroyed before or after the children vanished? The polluted soil, was it merely the byproduct of copper stripping or part of something deliberately sinister? The children's medical records, did they describe poisoning that built over years, or did they mark the slow countdown to something far worse? No one could answer with certainty. For parents in the community, the case became unbearable in its symbolism. Lilly and Jack were not just two children, they were every child. They represented the fragility of trust between families and the systems meant to safeguard them. Every unanswered question reminded mothers and fathers that their own children could be next if negligence and silence continued. The protests grew more furious. Community meetings turned into shouting matches. Local politicians scrambled to appear concerned, but the crowd was not satisfied. They demanded resignations. They demanded accountability. They demanded to know why two children's lives had been sacrificed to bureaucracy and delay. In living rooms, families whispered their own theories. Some believed the RCMP knew more than they were saying, withholding information in the name of protecting the investigation. Others suspected that Martell had protection from someone in power, that his ability to burn openly and repeatedly without consequence couldn't be explained by incompetence alone. Whether these suspicions were true or not, the distrust itself was corrosive. The community no longer believed the system could protect them. For investigators, The evidence piled up like layers of ash, damning, disturbing, but inconclusive. Polluted soil, charred toys, medical records of poisoned lungs. These fragments painted a picture of tragedy but not resolution. They confirmed suffering but did not explain disappearance. They cried out for accountability but left the most essential truth unanswered. Where are Lilly and Jack? That question hung over everything, over town halls packed with angry citizens, over candlelit vigils lined with grieving parents, over classrooms missing two voices. It was the question that haunted every officer, every neighbor, every reporter covering the case. It was the question that turned this tragedy into a movement, one that would not fade even as the smoke finally cleared. Because in the end, the community understood something the authorities seemed to forget. Justice isn't only about punishment. It is about truth. And until the truth of Lilly and Jack's fate is known, every institution that failed them will remain on trial, their silence heavier than any smoke that ever drifted through the town. The fires burned in Martell's backyard, but the silence belonged to everyone. The most haunting sound was not the crackle of flames or the coughing of children. It was silence. Silence in classrooms where two empty desks stood untouched, their owners vanished into a void no one could explain. Silence in backyards once filled with children's laughter, where parents now watched their kids more closely, terrified that absence could strike again. Silence in the town streets after the protests had marched by, leaving behind echoes of chants that faded into questions. Silence from officials who spoke in clipped phrases, avoiding the truths that everyone feared. This silence was not peaceful. It was suffocating. It lingered heavier than smoke, pressing on the community's lungs as surely as Martell's toxic fires had done. For every cough that once broke the night air, there was now a void, a pause, a question no one dared to voice aloud. Silence had become the language of grief and suspicion. The smoke may have cleared, but its shadow never left. The acrid stench had seeped into curtains, into carpets, into memory. No amount of open windows or spring breezes could scrub it away. The ground where the burn pits smoldered remained scarred, dark rings of earth that no grass dared reclaim. Even after the investigators left, after the equipment was packed away, neighbors swore the place still carried the smell of chemicals, phantom fumes rising from the soil as if the land itself refused to forget. And woven through all of this was the absence of Lilly and Jack. Their names spoken in whispers, their photographs staring from posters, their toys half melted in the ash pits. They were still missing. Missing from their school. Missing from the sidewalks where they once rode bikes. Missing from the family gatherings where cousins asked, "When will Lilly and Jack come home?" No one had an answer. Not the RCMP, not the doctors, not the parents who had filed complaints until their voices cracked. The silence surrounding the children's fate became more painful than the smoke ever was. The truth remained buried in ash. Investigators could collect samples, measure toxins, document fibers, but none of it spoke the words the community longed for. What happened to Lilly and Jack? Every discovery, the polluted soil, the charred toys, the medical records charting coughs and fatigue, felt like pages torn from a story without its ending. A story cut off mid-sentence. The fragments pointed to tragedy but stopped short of confession. For every clue, there was a shadow. The doll's melted face. Was it burned before the children vanished, or after? The toy truck's blackened plastic. Was it discarded junk, or part of a cover-up? The fibers of clothing, were they remnants of long-forgotten garments, or proof that something unthinkable had happened in Martell's fires? Each answer branched into darker questions, and with each unanswered question, the silence grew heavier. The silence spread into classrooms. Teachers tried to continue their lessons, but eyes flickered to the empty desks. Homework assignments were given, but the absence of Lilly and Jack was louder than any recited poem or math equation. Their classmates grew quieter, subdued, their games tinged with unease. Some children began asking bluntly what adults dared not. Are Lilly and Jack dead? The teachers never had a reply. They filled the air with platitudes. We're still looking, we hope they come home. But even young minds sensed the hollowness of those words. In backyards, parents kept their children closer. Where once kids roamed freely from fence to fence, playdates now came with restrictions. Mothers sat outside watching, scanning the horizon as if danger still lurked in the treeline. Fathers reinforced locks, built higher fences, and made quiet pacts with neighbors. We will not let this happen again. But the unspoken fear lingered. If Lilly and Jack could vanish while surrounded by so many warnings, what protection did fences and locks really offer? The silence in government offices was worse. Families who filed complaints replayed every ignored phone call, every unanswered email, every inspection report that went nowhere. Now those families asked officials directly, "Why did you not act? Why did you not come?" The replies were evasive, technical, bureaucratic. Pending resources. Limited jurisdiction. Awaiting follow-up. The words sounded like excuses, like the language of delay. To grieving parents, they sounded like betrayal. And the RCMP? They spoke in press conferences, in brief statements full of careful words. They could not confirm. They could not deny. They asked for patience, for faith in the investigation. But patience had run out, and faith had burned away like Martell's fires. The community no longer wanted phrases. They wanted truth. Because until someone answered, until someone broke the silence, the story of Daniel Martell's fires would continue to smolder. Not as distant memory, but as a wound that refused to heal. Forensic experts returned to the site again and again, but their work yielded more sorrow than certainty. Each test confirmed toxins, each report detailed hazards, each photograph captured the scarred landscape. But science could not measure absence. Instruments could not detect the footsteps of 2 missing children. Ash samples could not tell the final moments of Lilly and Jack's lives. The investigators had data, but the community had grief, and data could not fill empty desks or stop the whispers of classmates asking, "Why aren't they here?" The silence became personal. For parents, it echoed in bedtime routines. They tucked their children in and stared longer at the ceiling, wondering how many chances had been missed, how many warnings ignored. For grandparents, it echoed in stories half told, in the lullabies they once sang but now broke off mid-verse, unable to finish without tears. For siblings and cousins, it echoed in playtimes that ended too quickly, games missing the voices that once carried them forward. Silence also crept into the media. At first, coverage was relentless. Headlines, interviews, footage of protests. But as weeks passed without resolution, the stories grew shorter, the updates less frequent. Journalists still asked questions, but their voices carried fatigue. Even news cycles have a rhythm, and the community feared that Lilly and Jack's story was slipping from urgency into history. To them, silence in the media was another betrayal. Yet the silence did something else. It hardened resolve. For some, the lack of answers made the fight louder. Parents organized marches even after the cameras left. Neighbors formed citizen groups, promising to hold every agency accountable. Activists demanded new legislation against backyard burns, insisting that Lilly and Jack's suffering would not be in vain. Their chants and signs filled the streets, but even in their noise, silence was present, because beneath the slogans, the one question remained unanswered. Where are Lilly and Jack? No chant could replace that truth. No law could resurrect what was lost. No march could pull the children back from wherever they had gone. And so, even as the noise of outrage filled the streets, silence haunted the edges. Some nights, neighbors swore they still heard echoes of the children, phantoms of laughter, the rhythm of a bike wheel on pavement, the sound of a toy bouncing against wood. Rational minds dismissed it as memory playing tricks, but grief is not rational. To those who had lived through the smoke, through the protests, through the silence, these echoes were both comfort and torment. Comfort, because they reminded people of Lilly and Jack as they once were. Torment, because they underlined how gone they now seemed. Others claimed the land itself carried the memory, that the scarred soil whispered, that the burned earth refused to grow back not because of toxins, but because it remembered. They spoke of the backyard as a graveyard without markers, a place where silence was the loudest sound of all. Whether superstition or truth, no one wanted to walk there after nightfall. The place was cursed, and its silence cursed the town. And still, the story refused to end. Journalists returned, each anniversary marked with vigils and interviews. Candles flickered against posters, the faces of Lilly and Jack glowing in soft light. Their names were spoken in prayers, in chants, in songs. The community would not let silence erase them, even if the institutions seemed content to move on. Because silence is not just the absence of sound, it is the presence of neglect. It is the gap where truth should be. And until that gap is filled, until someone finally speaks the words the community longs for, the silence of Lilly and Jack's disappearance will remain the loudest sound of all. The fires may have burned out. The smoke may have cleared. But silence endures. It hangs in classrooms, in backyards, in government offices. It clings to the soil, the toys, the medical records. It fills every unanswered question with dread. And until someone answers, until someone breaks the silence, the story of Daniel Martell's fires will continue to smolder, refusing to be extinguished, refusing to be forgotten, demanding that every person who sees Lilly and Jack's faces ask themselves the same haunting question: where are they?